Welcome, everybody. We're going to call to order the committee on the House Committee on Elections. Our first order of business is the approval of the very well-written minutes that were sent out by the committee assistant. Do I have a motion? Representative Neighbor.
It was so nice of you to give that great description of her minutes, and I would second that, but I would move that we approve the minutes.
Okay, I've got a motion by Representative Neighbor and a second by Representative Dodson. Is there any discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor of approving the February 20th minutes signify by saying aye. All opposed, no. Okay, the ayes appear to have it. The minutes pass. All right, our committee, our only order of business other than that today is an informational hearing on SB 368. By way of a reminder, the object here is we don't know when the Senate's going to pass these out, and so I didn't want to wait till the last minute and try to jam in a bunch of hearings. So we're going to go ahead and hear testimony on this, and then at a later date, if it passes out, we'll have a perfunctory hearing and then work the bill if we decide to do, if that's the will of the committee. All right, with that, I'm going to start with proponent testimony. Mr. Green has submitted written testimony, but he's graciously also, oh, I'm sorry, I apologize, I am ahead of myself. Mr. Revisor, could you please tell us what is in Senate Bill 368? Good practice, though. You're ready when I call you up.
Mike Hyman, the Revisor of Statutes Office. I'm going to sit because this is a very short bill. The explanation is longer than the bill, I think, but anyway, it says no form of ranked choice voting method shall be used in determining the election or nomination of any candidate to a federal, state, county, or municipal office. And then it defines ranked choice voting and provides that any ordinance, resolution, regulation, and so on adopted prior to July 1, 2024 would be null and void. I'll make a comment. The only governmental entity that could possibly do ranked choice voting in Kansas would be cities. And to my knowledge, none have done it, but otherwise it would require statutory authority to allow ranked choice voting in any other type of election.
Okay, are there any questions for the revisor on the contents of the bill? Mr. Ranking Minority Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mike. With this, so 2020, the Democratic Party did a presidential preference primary. Would this prohibit them from doing that? There was a ranked choice system that they used.
I think your party provisions are done separate. I don't think they're statutory, but you've got Clay that can.
Let's say nomination. I'll save that question for later. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I had a very similar question. Do we have the authority to tell a political party that they can't use a method of voting in a primary for a nomination?
I don't think we do, but you've got the Secretary of State's representative here that can get into detail.
Okay. Any other questions for the revisor? All right, I'm sorry, Mr. Vice Chairman, I apologize.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, having a sort of a preemptive ban on something, we've done that in some other issues. Is that not totally, or is this totally a one-off in statute?
There are preemptive bans, especially regarding local government, cities and counties in particular. There have been a number of them in the past 10 years.
Okay. All right. So with that, I'm going to move to proponent testimony. And now I'm going to welcome Steve Green to the committee. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I am not. You'll see on the testimony, Madeline Malise from Opportunity Solutions Project. She's actually on maternity leave, so you're getting JV at best, maybe even C team on this testimony. But I am here to talk about this bill specifically in support of Senate Bill 368 and why we think it's all worth your consideration. So thank you for the opportunity. For allowing me to testify. This bill, as mentioned by the revisor, is pretty simple. It just prohibit ranked choice voting for all federal, state, and local elections. Just to give a little historical context, in 2023, this is sort of trying to address what we're seeing nationally as sort of a national trend. There was around 74 bills across the country for proponents of ranked choice voting. But what you've seen in both red and blue states is sort of a firewall or protection and making sure that it isn't adopted. Currently, there are 2 states that allow for ranked choice voting statewide. That's Maine and Alaska. But in 2020, the state of Massachusetts, the voters actually overwhelmingly rejected and voted down a referendum to adopt ranked choice voting. Just a couple years ago in California, Governor Gavin Newsom vetoed a ranked choice voting bill, and in his statement, he said it's something to the effect of there's local municipalities that have ranked choice voting, but I do agree that it generally causes more confusion than clarity for the voter. So there's sort of, we outlined 3 or 4 reasons why we think you should support this bill. First, ranked choice voting requires legitimate ballots to be discarded. How does this happen? Under a ranked choice system, voters must vote for all the candidates in a race by ranking them on one ballot. When no candidate receives more than 50% of the vote, in the first round of tabulation, some voters' ballots might be tossed aside to get a sort of a majority in subsequent rounds. In your testimony, and it's an attachment, I actually included a ballot that was used in 2013 for a ranked choice voting in the city of Minneapolis. There's close to over 40 candidates that's listed, and that results in about 40,000 different combinations that a person or that people could use in voting for a ranked choice ballot candidate. And really, it just summarizes what our main opposition is, which is this doesn't actually create voter clarity. It creates more confusion when a person might, instead of looking at one candidate that they would vote for, having to suddenly rank up to 12, 15 different candidates. And so you have the testimony in front of me. I will defer any technical questions, if that's okay, to the Secretary of State's office with regard to statute. And if I don't know the answer, I'll follow up with Opportunity Solutions Project. But I appreciate you letting me testify on this bill. Please, at the appropriate time, I'm happy to answer any questions you all have.
All right, are there any questions for Mr. Green? Oh, you're getting off easy. That's
Take it.
okay. Thank you very much. All right. I don't have any other conferees listed as oral, providing oral testimony. Does anybody wish to speak as a proponent on this bill? Okay, seeing none, I'll move to our neutral testimony, and I've got one conferee listed, Mr. Clay Barker from the Secretary of State's office. Welcome to the committee. Welcome back to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clay Barker, General Counsel for the Kansas Secretary of State. The Office of the Secretary of State is neutral on this bill. As I testified in Senate, Fed, and State, sort of neutral but supportive of it, of the idea. I think you all know what ranked choice voting is, and it's there to solve the same problem that runoff elections are trying to solve, or limiting how many candidates can get in a race, so you get down to the people that are the plausible winners, so the voters don't disperse their votes too much. As was testified earlier, it's used in 2 states right now, Alaska and Maine, that I'm aware of, and about 50 cities. And some of those cities run their own elections. I mean, Kansas elections are run at county. In some states, cities run the election, and they have more freedom to decide what they're going to do. In Utah, the legislature enacted legislation that allowed cities to experiment with ranked choice voting. So there it was a legislative grant of authority to certain cities. It is our position in Kansas that the statute is 25702, which was adopted in 1861, mandates plurality voting for any office that's elected. The Attorney General, and that would include cities, I know the revisor has a different opinion that city home rule could override that and perhaps allow a city to do ranked choice voting. And the Attorney General gave an Attorney General's opinion in 2020 where the question was, could the legislature adopt ranked choice voting or would it require a constitutional change? And their opinion was the legislature has the authority to do it because of the way our Constitution's worded. So whether a city could legally do this, I'll just say it's a toss-up, it's vague. Another part is the pragmatic reality that not a single piece of equipment, voting equipment in Kansas is certified to do ranked choice voting. We'd have to recertify everything, and there's a lot of logistics tail to this, different ballots, different training. So pragmatically, I don't think any county could pull it off, even if a city wanted to do it. And that's why we believe that this legislation is not redundant. It's not just reaffirming something that's already banned. It is possibly vague, and it would prevent any court from giving an odd opinion or a city going off and trying to do this by itself. And as was mentioned, there are problems with ranked choice voting, and we came up with 3. One is there really is no public interest in changing the way Kansas votes. There's no grassroots surge of enthusiasm or interest in this, and this would take a lot of essentially retraining of voters of how to vote to make their vote count. Second, ranked choice voting can be complex, that the voter has to rank every candidate, and there's a thing called voter exhaustion, where they only maybe rate the first 2 or 3 because they just don't know what the other names are, and that can throw the results off of the ranked choice voting effect. And third, it would cost a lot of money. Again, recalibrating the machines, new design of ballots, new training of staff. And so that's why we're neutral. It's the legislature's decision, but I'm supportive of this bill. And I stand for questions.
Are there any questions for Mr. Barker? So I have a question. Or, I'm sorry, you had a question? Please go ahead. Okay, sorry. Okay, I apologize. So do you have any idea what the impetus was for the 1872 law that compelled the legislature to pass that?
Mr. Chair, 1861 is I think it was the first or second election statute passed in Kansas, and it just said every race will be plurality, unless the legislature specifically says otherwise. And the only race I'm aware of where they've done that is precinct leader replacement elections. It says majority vote. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to add in one other piece. I learned, kind of to my surprise, is states that do runoff elections like Georgia or Louisiana allow their military voters to rank choice. That's how they can have the runoff race so close to the original general election. That's kind of a unique provision in their law. I always wondered how they could do it so quickly with the 45-day mailing, and that's how. That's a very limited exception.
Representative Berquist.
Were you working with the state when the state law was changed to require that a primary not be held unless, in the case of a mayor's race in the state, unless there was at least four candidates, there would be simply a general election between 3 candidates, and then you could charter. I think at the time you could charter out of it if you chose to as a city, but most of them just stayed with whatever was going on, and it seemed to work. But do you know what the impetus was behind making that law work to where it had to be a primary if there was 4?
Representative, I'm aware of the law. I don't recall when the change happened or why. I could ask Mr. Caskey. He may be more knowledgeable of that.
I was in the middle of a race like that, and I had to run against 2 others in a general election. It had to work a little harder.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Barker?
Mr. Chair, you asked a question about political parties. If the state is running the election, there's no ranked choice voting. If the party's running it, they can do whatever they want. There's a Supreme Court cases in 1990, or maybe a year or 2 after, said that states cannot tell political parties how to run their internal business, and that's why Kansas then eliminated a whole spew of laws that used to tell political parties exactly how they had to structure and operate in Kansas.
So if I understand what you're saying correctly, if for the August primary, because we're the ones that are administering that election, we have the ability to ban ranked choice voting.
That would be our interpretation, Mr. Chair. If the state's running the election, the state can say how it's going to be run. If it's a complete internal party function, like happened with the presidential races until this year, it's the party decides.
Okay. All right. Representative Hoagland.
I just want to say that, thank you. I just want to say that I did rank choice voting on the Democratic primary. And although it's the only time I've ever done it, it wasn't hard. So I don't think the confusion is quite as bad as you think it might be.
Any questions for Mr. Barker? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much. Mr. Barker is the only. Okay. Okay. Well, then we'll get the minutes updated. I'll welcome Sage Okay, sorry. I apologize. Welcome to the committee. Sorry I butchered your name.
There are some concerns, as mentioned, with voter fatigue and just the general complexity of this, as well as the expenditure that it would cost for a city to move to ranked choice voting. So it's not anything that we're aware of cities having an interest in. That being said, from our standpoint, it is a limit on home rule authority for cities. I know that there's been some discussion about whether or not cities actually have the home rule authority to do that. But with that being said, we just generally oppose anything that's going to limit a city's home rule authority.
You're neutral.
Yes, but we are neutral.
Okay.
So we would ask that if the committee does look to pass this out favorably, that they exempt cities from it.
Okay. Which we think is the only one to which it would apply. So, okay. That will be a interesting bill to describe on the floor. Who wants to carry it? Okay. Are there any questions? Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Sorry we screwed up the schedule there. Is there anybody else wishing to speak as a neutral? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to move to opponent testimony. And the first person that I have listed is Richard Pund on WebEx. Do we have him on WebEx? Sir, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chair Proctor. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Richard Pund, and I'm a resident of Overland Park. I oppose SB 368. I am, I guess you could say, a grassroots supporter of ranked choice voting in the state of Kansas. There are some of us, I'm sure there are, but I would like to see the committee take the opposite approach and explicitly allow ranked choice for local elections, particularly cities. One reason I support ranked choice, and I'll try to limit it to this one because it's a bill banning it, not enacting it. But I believe that ranked choice would solve a problem that this committee has been trying to deal with for this session and the last, and that's that we have elections where candidates are elected with a plurality instead of a majority. And I know there have been a number of bills and hearings on how to solve that problem. In the text of this bill, you can see that ranked choice allows, it goes until a candidate has majority support. So this would solve the problem that the committee has been dealing with. So I was surprised that the legislator is looking at banning it when it is a solution to that problem. I'd also like to try to rebut some of the arguments that proponents of this bill gave during the Senate hearing. The first one I've heard of was around exhausted ballots. So in my view of it, in a ranked ballot election, exhausted ballots are treated the same way that we treat undervotes. So in my written testimony, I had an example from our governor's race where there were a number of exhausted ballots, or in our case, undervotes, right? Ballots that are blank, that they show up, they don't vote for anyone. Those are still counted, but they're not included in the vote total. With a ranked ballot election, they're treated the same way. They're just set into the exhausted pile once all of the rankings have been done. I also saw in the official results of our current elections that we don't include write-in candidates either. And we aren't saying that those, right now, no one's claiming that those ballots are being tossed out. They're just being set aside. And exhausted ballots in a ranked election are treated the same way. The other thing I'd like to talk about is the amount of time that it takes for a ranked election to be conducted. In Maine, they release unofficial and partial results like we do today. And a statewide ranked election in 2020 in Maine for senator was decided on the next day, which is about the same speed that we do things now. And so those are my points against the rebuttal, I guess. But yeah, and to concur with what the League of Kansas Municipalities was saying, I would like to see that we allow ranked choice in local elections. If the city decides that it's worth the investment and the time in voter education in changing how they choose the representatives, then they obviously think that it's worth it. And so I don't think the state should stand in their way of doing that. Thank you for your time, and I'll stay on to answer any questions if there are any.
Okay, are there any questions for Mr. Pund? Mr. Vice Chairman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your testimony. I do have a question because I kind of distinctly remember the Alaska Senate race with, I think it was Murkowski, where they used ranked choice voting. And and my memory might be wrong on this, but I was thinking that the person who was maybe in second place with the number 1 votes ended up winning in the end. Has that not happened with ranked choice voting? And don't you think that's very confusing to voters as to how such a possibility could actually occur?
Yeah, that is how ranked choice is designed to work. And I kind of see it as a case of, think of an election where maybe there's multiple candidates who have the same viewpoints, right? Like imagine a race with 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat in a Republican majority district. If we were to use ranked choice for that, it's likely that maybe the Democrat gets the most first choice votes because the votes are split between the 2 Republicans. But then when the last place Republican gets eliminated, a lot of those votes are generally transferred to the other one in their same party. And so if, even though that candidate had second, was in, you could say, second place, they had the second most first choice votes, they still end up with that majority because that's what most of the people prefer. Sorry, does that answer your question?
No, I appreciate that response. I did have one other thing, and I really appreciate your testimony. I think it's actually very well thought out. The question about the 2017 sort of special committee from elections that looked at ranked choice voting and was, I guess, basically kind of positive about it, or at least neutral to positive about it. Do you not consider that in the current election environment, it has changed quite a lot since 2017, and just people are more, that they will have more confidence in the election if there's just more clarity about winners and losers? I mean, do you not see that as being an issue?
No, I think that's a good point about it. And maybe that's, trying to think of how I would answer that. So I could see it being a case of, you're right, like, oh, why was this candidate who started out in 4th place end up winning, right? I think that just comes back to voter education and being able to say, well, whoever has a consensus support, right, or concurrent support with which is the candidate that can develop that consensus. Maybe they aren't everyone's first choice, but again, if we're looking to choose a representative that people generally agree on, they can build that support through this ranking system by saying, well, vote for me, but rank my friend second, and that sort of thing. But I guess to your point about maybe voter confusion or having transparency in the results, I think that would be left up to how much transparency do we want to give in reporting this? Do we want to give first choice results only until all the ballots can be tabulated, or give the full voting record as those are counted, with the understanding that those results will look like they're changing, even though we're really just counting the ballots, and updating the results as we get them?
Are there any more questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you, sir, for your testimony. The last in-person opponent that I have listed is Mr. Davis Hammett. Welcome back to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. First off, I want to start off by saying we are not here discussing a bill that's about enacting ranked choice voting. So this is not really about the qualities of ranked choice voting, the merit of it, if it's good or bad. This is about preemptively shutting down the conversation and banning this from being able to happen in any local community. So if a local community decides that this is what they think is right for them, y'all are saying, no, we decide what's right for your local community in this. Right now, also, this is a sort of a bizarre position to be in, to testify on a bill about something that doesn't happen, because it doesn't happen anywhere right now. Whenever it talks about grassroots support, I would have some disagreement. Over the last decade, I've heard lots of different people speak on this. In the Senate, so many people were speaking in opposition to this bill that they actually had to just cut them off and not let them testify. I think just the nature of this is an informational thing. We might have seen more testimony if it was a regular hearing. But there are serious issues that we know about and that y'all discuss in this committee about the fact that most of our governors recently have not reached a majority of the vote. And I really think about, and I brought this up in the Senate, is when we think about ranked choice voting, it's worth going back to 2018, and particularly for members of this committee who are Republicans, and thinking back to the Congressional District 2 Republican primary. Steve Watkins won the Republican primary with 26%, of the vote. And then he would go on to the general and barely beat Paul Davis. And this was, of course, a candidate and a short-lived representative who was sort of shrouded with controversy, right? That's 26% of the vote, and there was lots of news about how his father had dumped tons of money into his campaign, lots of headache for the Republican Party of Kansas, I imagine, through that experience. And this is someone who, in a ranked choice voting system, this is someone who is running against Senator Tyson. A variety of other state legislators were running for that race. Who knows who would have ended up with 50% after the first round, of candidates who got 4%, got eliminated. And there might have been a candidate who, frankly, for the Republican Party, might have been less of a headache, but also would probably have been more representative of the primary voters. And that's really what ranked choice voting is about. But again, it's funny to even talk about this because this is not really a bill about the merits of ranked choice voting. It's a bill about just shutting down this thing that doesn't happen from ever being able to happen. And in a way, I view that as shutting down really the discussion about it, the speech about it, the debate about if this is where we should go. As Representative Berquist said, you have a situation where you have 3 mayor candidates running. You could feasibly have a mayor candidate win in that election with, like 34% of the vote, 35% of the vote. And this is something that could address that. And when you think about that, which I imagine was a cost-saving measure for not having to have all these additional elections, that's really what ranked choice voting in principle is about. It is an instant runoff election. That's the idea. And so a couple months ago, or maybe just a month ago, I don't know, this session feels very long already, when we were discussing about having a runoff election later, well, these are the kind of vehicles that make it so instead of having to have a runoff election later, people can say, this is my first candidate, this is my second candidate. And then if, everyone's all split across, then it just goes to that second candidate so that they can decide it easier. The most voters get to participate in what would be a runoff. Because as we discussed, when you actually have a runoff election, you lose a lot of voters. Don't show up for that second election happening in December or whenever. So there is, and as was mentioned and brought up, in 2017, there was a bipartisan, bicameral, the Senate and House got together to have an interim committee to study this, and had lots of experts from around the country come and present on it. And they thought that it had some promise, but they recognized Kansas's election infrastructure wasn't really there to administer it. And so, their recommendation was to do nothing. And I really think about this bill, this is, right now the recommendation from that was to do nothing. And this is something that, frankly, I just don't understand. And I don't understand why, of all the important things, this is sort of even a bill being discussed. And the last thing I'll mention is the point made by, the proponent group of this bill was this idea about ballots being tossed. as the previous opponent conferee explained. So if it's exhausted, that's like, maybe in a race with lots of candidates, you only selected one candidate, and your candidate got 5% of the vote, and so they're eliminated. But you didn't select a second candidate, so for that one race, you don't have a vote anymore because it was exhausted. The rest of your ballot is still counted, so your ballot's not tossed. And I just want to kind of juxtapose this with also the proponent group supports abolishing the 3-day grace period, which is about your entire ballot not being counted. And so, ranked choice voting doesn't throw out ballots. As was said, even if you undervote, this happens all the time. It's a headache if you've tried to do some research on our elections, because sometimes the math doesn't math, and then you have to go, oh, sometimes people skip a race. Maybe you see that school board race and you go, oh my gosh, I don't know any of these candidates. And so you just decide, I'm going to fill out everyone I know, but I'm just not going to vote for that race. That happens all the time. Some people get there and only vote for president, don't vote for anything else. Maybe only vote for president and only vote for you because you're their state rep who came and knocked on their door and talked to them, right? But don't vote for anything else. And so those are undervotes, which is very comparable to an exhausted ballot ranked choice voting. So just in conclusion, there's local control issues, there's community involvement issues, and the reality is that today ranked choice voting presents no issues in Kansas because it doesn't happen. So I just don't think the committee should preemptively entertain a ban to shut down the discussion on if this is a viable option for Kansas or not. And with that, I'm happy to stand for questions.
Are there any questions for Mr. Hammond? So I'd ask you the same question that the Vice Chairman asked the previous conferee. Do you think that it helps or hurts voter confidence if people can't explain how one person won and another person lost?
So I think that it could, but there's kind of two parts, right? Would this inherently undermine voter confidence? No, if people can't explain. And that's a big thing, right? And this is something actually, even in 2020, I helped put together an explainer because one of the major parties was going to do ranked choice voting. Because if you're unfamiliar with it, you do need to understand it. It's a new system, it takes a minute. And so if people are given accurate information, if a local government was to do this and there was a lot of awareness about it, right, it can be fine. If people understand, how this is working, that, it's that candidate who got 5% of the vote who's being eliminated, and then everyone who voted for them, it's going to their second choice. If you explain this to people, they can get it. Again, we're not really taking a stance on if this is the right choice for Kansas or not. But I think like a lot of election misinformation or sort of lack of confidence, that often comes just because no one has provided them accurate information. And I'll say even some people who spoke during the election integrity interim committee last fall, some of those folks I've talked to before have reached out to me and, they're like, on election night, the votes are flipping. And I explained like, okay, well, where were you seeing that? Oh, you were looking at the New York Times? Well, what they're doing is they just have someone trying to scrape election results, and those election results are preliminary. And so, sometimes someone late at night might have entered it wrong for a precinct, but before the election gets certified, that gets corrected. This kind of stuff happens all the time where when you're trying to, I think the Secretary of State's office has explained this before, is they don't actually have to tell you election night results. They do that as sort of a public service. But the reason those aren't real results is because we know at the late hours of night, you're not going to be 100% certain about that. You need some time to go back and be like, okay, was everything entered properly? We see this all the time. It happens on election night. A county, their results internally are not wrong, but someone, when they typed it into the reporting machine, had inversed it. And then that gets corrected the next day. And when people understand that, though, when they understand that's not the real result, this is just, this sort of media and public service, it's not real, it's not certified, and then they can understand, oh, okay, that's where my misunderstanding comes from that can be corrected. So I'm a strong believer that legislation doesn't actually build voter confidence. People having education on how our system works is what builds voter confidence.
So to your point of, we're shutting, there's this bill would shut down the conversation, and it's not really the role of the state legislature to stop a debate before it begins. Do you think that there's a role for us in enacting public policy that does improve voter confidence?
So, I mean, we know how bills are in here, right? That can mean a million things, because that public policy could be every registered Kansas voter gets an information packet, before the election explaining the procedures in place. That could be something that, as you know, we oppose, like the 3-day grace period, which we would oppose because I don't think that actually builds voter confidence. And I think those kind of things, sometimes when we're seeking to build voter confidence, policies that get prioritized can have the opposite effect because, for example, in another 2018 Republican primary election was the governor's election, where Jeff Collier versus Chris Kobach, extremely close election, if not one of the closest statewide elections in Kansas history. It was about like 350 votes. And we know that there were tons of provisional ballots that were being, alleged signature mismatch. Voters weren't contacted about that, and they were being rejected. And I would argue illegally, and the legislature actually the next year fixed that to say you have to try to contact them. But that creates another doubt in elections when people are hearing, oh, counties aren't counting ballots that duly, that citizens cast. And so there's this balancing act. But again, I think, there's plenty of legislation that can improve transparency, could improve public education and understanding. But I'm very hesitant to support legislation that is sort of covered in the idea of election integrity, but really is likely to have negative impacts on if a voter is able to vote or have their vote counted.
Representative Howell.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I apologize for being late. So I understand your viewpoint, and I always appreciate hearing from you when you come testify. So, but even if we were to pass this piece of legislation, we can always change our laws if we had a compelling reason to do so. I mean, that's always true. If there was, for some reason, a mass protest across the state and said we want to have ranked choice voting in our state, it's something that we could change later. And I see, just from the little bit of studying I've done on ranked choice voting, there seems to be a lot of problems that I don't see really good paths forward for it to be practical for our state in particular.
So again, I would say though, two things, like we're not doing it, right? And even something you might see as a problem, a specific community might not, and might decide that it's right. To the first part though, on yes, the legislature can do something and then, undo it if they want to. But realistically, like looking at the legislature, just to be frank, we know that there's lots of policies that the Kansas public overwhelmingly support that the Kansas legislature does not pass. And so that's sort of, if I was confident, right, that the Kansas legislature, if the public, changed their mind and was really supportive of this, that would mean it would become law. But that's not the case so often in the Kansas legislature. And so in this, again, it's sort of the right of a local community of self-determination about what's right for them, how they want to select their leaders. And I think it's a disservice to take that away from them when we really don't know if they could ever get it back. even if things do change, even if there is overwhelming public consensus to go to this, that doesn't necessarily mean the legislature will give this right back.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Hammett? Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Hammett. Actually, very, very interesting commentary. But I would like to throw out to you, do you not think that ranked choice voting, I mean, again, this is primarily, of course, presume, state elections are off the table. There's no way the legislature is going to do that. I mean, currently it would just be some city, or I guess just city would be the only thing. But within cities, I mean, just pretend you have a city that is predominantly kind of Democrat-leaning or the population as such, that, is it not possible? I mean, if you looked at a city government or the city vote, like, just again, I'm kind of taking the Democrat Party, but, you have your kind of green faction, and then you have your minority faction, and then you have like your rainbow faction, or, whatever. But you have these kind of different sort of motivational groups. Do you not think that a movement to go to ranked choice voting could not actually be, that two of the factions kind of ganging up on the third, thinking that with ranked choice voting, that somehow they could make sure that none of that group, gets on the city board? I mean, that it wouldn't actually be motivated more by an implicit kind of power calculation as to this would benefit our faction versus the other. I mean, are you not concerned that, that there is not motivations? I want to say, how could there not be political calculus if some city is going to be doing this, that some groups within the city see this as a way to benefit their long-term political interest?
Yeah, so again, my deep study into this is sort of limited, but I would say, I even think back to like fusion voting in Kansas, which is where, there was like the Farmers Party and the Labor Party, and then they could actually give their votes to a candidate. So when a governor was elected, they knew like, here's my base, here's the people who are actually supporting me, versus sort of the vagueness that comes along with the two major political parties where lots of people associate for lots of different reasons. I think that in any given circumstance that could really go either way. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I know one of the commonly discussed points of ranked choice voting in support is that it has the potential to sort of cool down polarization. Because if you're a candidate, for example, if you're a candidate who's really trying to disparage the other major candidate, that might backfire on you when it comes to people who, are you going to get their second choice vote? And, that's one of the theories behind it, is it might encourage politicians to be kinder to each other because they want to still appeal to get those, elimination votes. But who knows, right? Like, there is all sorts of political calculation, and I don't really think that it, again, not an expert in this, but I don't think it would inherently benefit any ideology or political party. I'm sure that would just go down to, local politics on what sort of issues and candidates build around each other and how they campaign and talk about each other.
Representative Neighbor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And one of the things that the past representative mentioned, local elections, commissioners, school boards, cities, all of those are nonpartisan. Nonpartisan. And yet we're having a conversation here about if you had one party and it was another party and you knew the strength of this party and that. Doesn't that put us in the area then of saying, okay, everything is going to be political now. You're going to be on one side or you're going to be on the other. And there's a reason why those elections are nonpartisan. And I go back to school board, and I would say, Representative, when we had 4 candidates going down to 3 or whatever, I was here then, but that, I think, had to do with money at that particular time, because local elections can cost you millions and millions of dollars. School boards, if they ask for an election, they have to pay for that. And it's not always built in to their budget, how many millions, depending on what it takes. And that's usually either bonds or members. So, I'm not sure when we look at this, are we looking at this from a political stance and trying to make something political? Or are we just discussing the possibility of what could be? Because if this has no effect on us, elected body, state reps, the governor, the other offices, why isn't this a local issue? Why are we demanding or telling local people, you can't do this your way? Maybe it'll save money in a small community. Maybe it wouldn't, I don't know. But all of a sudden, to me, we're overstepping that local control, which is a nonpartisan election issue. And so I'm not sure how this plays. Would you agree with that or not, or?
Yeah, I mean, I would
I'm
agree.
left-handed, female, and gray hair, so I have no excuses other than that.
So I would agree on the local control concern, and I would agree, we support local elections being nonpartisan for a variety of reasons, including the right of people who are in federal service or the military to be able to serve on their, on their kid's school board or something. But I think that, even the discussion that I was having with the vice chair, there is, even if there's not political parties, there are people in communities who are known for things. And so there's sort of alliances or whatever that might form. And I think too, one other thing about this is that often when you go to vote in a race with a lot of candidates, it's not so much that you have, what you usually know is maybe the candidate you prefer, but the candidate you definitely don't prefer, right? And so I think that that's the other element of this is maybe you're like, this is who I want, these people I'm okay with, but I really hope it's not that person. And that's what ranked choice voting also addresses, is it gives you the right to say, I might vote my values on a lost cause candidate who I know no way in hell are they gonna win, but then I know whenever they get eliminated, my vote's gonna go to my safe candidate instead of sort of by default, the idea of the spoiler effect by being like, if I vote my values on this sort of long shot candidate, then I'm basically voting for the person I really oppose, which this can help to address. And certainly, if it's political parties or if it's just personalities in local communities, I think that can be true either way.
Right, are there any other questions for Mr. Hammett? Okay, your grilling is over. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I don't have anybody else listed as an in-person opponent. Is there anybody wishing to give in-person testimony as an opponent? All right, if not, I'm going to close this informational hearing. Committee, that's our last order of business for today. Before I kind of go to the order here, we were going to have an informational hearing that might have turned into a hearing for Senate Bill 365, but a couple senators turned it into a Christmas tree yesterday, and it just went down in flames in the Senate. And so we have no bill to hear because it's dead. So I'm going to go ahead and, rather than try to jump in and put a different bill in, we're going to publish an agenda change tomorrow to cancel Thursday's hearing. I give you the gift of time on Thursday afternoon. We're going to take a look at what other things are still kind of on the plate for the Senate that they've passed out of Fed and state, and potentially schedule some more informational hearings for next week. But we'll get that agenda out tomorrow and give everybody plenty of heads up. So with that, is there anything for the good of the order? Okay, seeing none.